produce, it's a challenge. And overall, I think it's fair to say that dealing with the Mexican federal government has been a challenge. And I think that's something that we'll just have to move through going forward. Fortunately, the governor has excellent relationships with the leaders in Sonora and other places. So that side of it is working very well. But I think, that was one of the key issues that we heard from our manufacturers that they were having to deal with, and because it affects everybody all across the globe, especially North America, when governments don't play well together. So that's something that I would bring up.
Mark, specifically at Boeing, what things have you done? What pivot have you made to respond to this pandemic? And what do you see having to do going forward?
So I think early on, even before the public health orders came at the state level, we have a health department within Boeing that was in communication with CDC and other public health departments, and made the decision early on to adjust to the evolving situation and pandemic, and set up flexibility for our workforce to be able to distance as soon as possible. If you look at our operations here, we have about 4,700 employees now out in Mesa and across some smaller sites across the state. And pretty quickly, we were able to move about 80% or so off to telework. And it's worked really, I think, just better than anyone would have expected if you had to guess prior to this crisis, as we're all here sharing breakfast virtually together. I think then, then it's sort of a step process as if you roll through in future weeks like we all lived, in terms of understanding how the crisis was evolving and what that meant. So again, huge thanks to the governor's office for having an open line of communication so we could understand what the details meant for our having to comply with the public health orders, which we want to meet and then go above in all possible cases, ensuring that we understand what that means in terms of OSHA guidelines for distancing and for PPE. I think, the big challenge that we're all facing is just in terms of supply chain, both from a PPE perspective and then just supply chain generally, depending on how distributed our supply bases are as manufacturers across the globe. There's a lot of services available to you as a company if that's a challenge. Again, reach out to the Tech Council, reach out to the Manufacturers Council, Arizona Commerce Authority. My huge thanks to Sandra Watson and her team for being so accessible. I believe David Garofano on the line here. Reach out to your MEP. Just such a huge resource if you are struggling to find the information that you need to navigate this current situation. With the recent PPP Paycheck Protection Program, the last round had $4 billion coming to Arizona. That's 51,000 companies that access that. There's help out there, but just reach out. We are all better together as we try and navigate this current crisis. The last thing I'd just say is that one of the keys for us is just constant communication, and we talked about that from a state and local perspective. But the biggest one is communication with our teams, and it's not to say it's preaching to the choir here amongst all of you, but I think that's critical that our teams want to hear from us and understand what we're seeing relative to the public health orders and how are we going to keep them safe, but also how can we adjust as the situation evolves.
You mentioned PPE. We've all come to know what that term means, personal protection equipment. As the rest of the economy begins to go back to work, there's going to be tremendous demand for PPE. And, it's going to be difficult to restart businesses, manufacturing or otherwise, without that kind of protection in place. What can manufacturers do to position themselves to make sure they have adequate PPE to continue operations? Either one of you.
Yeah. Well, we have seen, just as Mark mentioned earlier, a tremendous outpouring and outreach from manufacturers that either are producing PPE or can have the capabilities to produce PPE. That has both been helpful and challenging, as Dave Garofano and Paul Hughes and others will know, because it has been a little bit of a rush of, here's what we can do and how we can help. That said, I think that we've done a very good job as a state and the county specifically in directing the PPE to the hospitals that need it the most, and to those folks that need it the most. Yeah, at the beginning of this, I don't think there was enough PPE in the world to supply even Arizona. So no one could have predicted this kind of a crisis. There are things that we can do moving forward to better prepare, keeping inventories higher and some of those things that we've heard about. I think we have to be careful not to overdo, because manufacturers can't spend these things and change these things overnight. That said, some have, and we have seen great work from Honeywell, of course. That's the shining star of an example, producing all of the N95 masks, but many other manufacturers too. We've all heard the examples, I think, of the liquor companies that are making hand sanitizers nowadays. So I think we've adapted pretty well. Still a lot more work to do, of course, and this will be a continuing need. Another point is grassroots type efforts. You might be surprised. My mother, for example, Liz Grigg, shout out to Liz Grigg, she's not watching, but she is making 120 Arizona state flag masks. And this is being paid for by one of our sponsors at the AMC. And we're going to give these masks to the entire state legislature and to the congressional delegation. So mom's just one blue hair, but there's little networks of people that are making these masks and equipment. And I think that, some of those efforts need to be exploited a little bit more too. That's just a drop in the bucket, but every little bit helps.
Mark, this sort of speaks to our resiliency as a state and manufacturing as an industry. What other things can the manufacturing industry be doing to support the healthcare industry, which has been so much in demand, and working the front line of this, putting their lives at risk? What other things are manufacturers doing, or can they do to support the healthcare worker?
So I think it's, like a layered approach, like we talked about. When we're trying to think about protecting our employees and what we see going forward, on just the previous note, we hear from the large manufacturers of PPE that they expect to be able to be meeting the current demand mid-year to the end of year. So, what does that translate to in terms of what we as manufacturers can do to helping the frontline healthcare workers, of which my wife is one, so it hits close to home, is to be able to, in all cases, as you all are doing, modify our work environments to be able to make that demand really only meet those critical essential functions that are needed in the manufacturing environment, and make use of just the great resources and tools that we have now with computers and phones, et cetera, to be able to keep people social distancing. That's one. Two, looking at the assets that we have, whether we are, as manufacturers, able to actually be in the PPE production space, or if there's something that we can do in support that we might not have thought of in a previous environment. So, for example, a huge shout out to Honeywell for the N95 production. That's just, like Allison said, such a shining star moment for us and as Arizonans, and something that we can all be very proud of. I'm proud of our team that early on at the Mesa site, we donated what little extra supply of PPE we had at the moment to local hospitals, as well as sterilization equipment. So just looking at what's on hand early on, I think just there's a million stories from manufacturers how they help. thinking how to do things in new and different ways. When we talk about, what's advanced manufacturing, a big part of that is 3D printing. So what Boeing has done is we've taken our 3D printers to create shields, including here at the Mesa site in Arizona, and those get sent off to FEMA for distribution for the worst scenarios across the country. Boeing's had the chance to take our Dream lifters, which are modified 747s that help distribute our parts across the globe, and then use that now to support distributing PPE. I think what's been exciting, and Allison's been a huge part of this, and I know, Steve, you have with the Tech Council as well, is looking at just the variety of manufacturing companies that want to be part of this response. And one of the challenges has been just not knowing what exactly the requirements are if you are already not a PPE producer. Certainly, you want to produce something that's responsive, but also is done in a safe way. And so, commend you to the Arizona Commerce Authority's website, ArizonaAZCommerce.com, COVID-19/manufacturing. They actually have information out there pointing to the FDA guidelines, and again, reaching out to David Garofano with MEP that can help understand what the requirements are. But there's been cases of groups that have really jumped in, such as Fabric in Tempe, that had MEP guidance and is now doing production of gowns, probably in a way they wouldn't have thought of doing 2 months ago. So point is that, we're able to get in and support. We have to do it the right way, but there's resources available at the state level. Also understanding from the FDA perspective, I know that the chambers all have done a great job of connecting with the congressional delegation, and their teams, particularly their state teams, have been so responsive. And if you're a manufacturer that's trying to navigate the new world of requirements on how to produce PPE in a appropriate way, their teams stand at the ready.
There's so many exciting stories about manufacturers contributing to the cause. Intel and onsemi both, provided PPE to people that needed it. Universal Avionics down in Tucson opened up its production facility for anyone who wanted to produce PPE in their space. Analyze Inc. Is making hand sanitizer. They have a chemistry background there, and so all kinds of great stories. One of the things that people are interested in is what can legislators be doing? Both of you are in policy and advocacy and your roles in your organizations. What can legislators at the state and federal level be doing to support manufacturers in this very difficult time?
Well, first I want to say that kudos to Governor Ducey, to the ACA team, to all those involved. Prior to this crisis, Arizona was in a top competitive position. We had more manufacturing jobs than we had workers. Things were going well. We had $1 billion in the rainy day fund. So I think that structure has been there. We've had a good system in place. So we're fortunate. We weren't coming out of this, in a negative place. Moving forward, we have to, of course, make sure that we allocate our resources wisely. We have to, make prudent use of our rainy day fund, while making sure to help everyone that's in need. We do have to advocate for more dollars from the federal government as well. Hopefully, we'll be seeing the next round of the stimulus coming soon, and we hope to see some support, significant support for manufacturers in that stimulus package. I have not seen any details on the next package, but I've heard some, rumbles about maybe an increase in the R&D tax credit at the federal level, and yes, Steve, that would be great, and other things too. Of course, nothing is set in stone and never is in DC, But those are some examples that would really be helpful to not only to help in this current crisis, but to help us grow afterwards. That's something that we are looking at now, is trying to map our assets and saying, okay, what do we have in Arizona? What are our existing assets? And after this crisis is over, or right now, in preparation, how can we leverage those assets and build upon them in the future and grow the economy in a smart, prudent, responsible way?
Mark?
Yeah, I think I just add that I think that's exactly right. And, to the degree that it's possible to provide certainty in uncertain times, and we know that, I don't say that lightly, it's certainly understandable to all this. There are going to be budget impacts across state and local governments. We recognize that. I think we just ask for an open line of communication to understand what those are, what they are seeing. We are facing, as manufacturers, similar challenges, but just as decisions are made on how to adjust, whether with rainy day fund or other tax measures, just knowing that manufacturers are still investing in Arizona. They are still investing in Arizona even during this current situation, and so making sure that we have the opportunity to still take advantage of that investment going forward, so that we can build upon the chance to come back and help all those that have been affected with their own employment.
So the state legislature, hasn't figured out what it wants to do yet, whether it wants to come back and deal with some of the bills that were on the docket, or whether it wants to come back and sine die, and one body thinks one way, another body thinks another. But I think there's a consensus that once this session does sine die, that the governor's going to call a special session. And I believe the rumor is there should be some sort of economic development package that comes out of that. Any rumors you're hearing about what that might look like, what might be in that to support businesses, both manufacturing and other?
I think right now it's a little early to say. There have been a lot of rumors. I think whatever the governor and team chooses to do, it will absolutely include manufacturers. It'll be a big part of the relief. Fortunately, we were able to get during the regular session some of our priority bills passed for manufacturers. And Steve, I know you're a big part of that too. The qualified facilities legislation with the R&D tax credit. So we got lucky there. We were able to get that through early. But that's obviously not enough now, because that was pre-COVID. But I do think that, I think that TBD, because more will be coming out on that soon.
Mark, anything you've heard?
No, just to note that we are seeing, the same situation play out across the states, wherein, they have modified, closed their sessions, et cetera. But it's all across all the states that I cover, we're seeing this special session timing start to pop up. And then it's a question too of, where states were going into all this and what the budget pressures were. And frankly, I think Arizona is just great as to where we were coming into it. And not to say that there aren't challenges ahead, but it's not unique to Arizona in having to take a hard look going forward.
I just want to add, I think that liability protections for manufacturers will be a big part of whatever legislation is passed moving forward, because that's been number one issue that we've been hearing from our manufacturers is, oh no, I hope we don't get a bunch of lawsuits after this, but we're expecting we will. So we need to have a statewide coverage to prevent one-offs like that will pop up. So I think that's going to be priority one.
Allison, you did a good job of describing the economic position we were in as a state prior to COVID-19. There was nothing more high priority during that time frame than finding talent,
right?
Placing talent. this may provide a little bit of a bubble for a while, but what challenges or opportunities do you see in the educational sort of workforce system in preparing students for employment with current unemployment rates as high as they are, and the impact, of course, on classroom training? Everything has gone remote.
Yeah. So we have been encouraging, and I know Mark has been doing the same, employers to use this time, sort of this at-home time, as a training period. And I think that there have been some companies that have utilized that in that way. Steve, you're right. We had more manufacturing jobs than we had workers, and now that's going to be completely turned on its head. So how can we now place some of these displaced workers? I do think that Arizona is in a good position, just due to the fact that we already have such a diverse manufacturing workforce. We, of course, have the engineers and the top tier talent, but we also have all of that mid-level and then sort of, entry-level skilled workers. So I think that, we can sort of retool and retrain our existing workforce, maybe a little easier than some states. I know that's something that I've been hearing from our manufacturers, that we've been doing these one-off calls, that they feel like that may be a bright spot in all this, is our ability to pivot people's roles a little bit faster.
Mark?
So I mean, a couple of things on different levels of, the workforce and educational perspective. First, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to the SciTech Institute and to the Tech Council for being with us sponsors of STEM signing days. So, just as we celebrate athletes when they're going to choose a university and do a signing day, we've started across the country STEM signing days for those graduating seniors that are going on to a STEM curriculum and career. We're excited that we'll be doing here in Arizona. So, first thing is, if you've got a graduating senior that's going on to a STEM career, go to scitechinstitute.org website before this Friday, before the deadline, and have them sign up and give them a chance to get recognized this June 11th. We had a session of STEM signing day in New Mexico last week, and something that was said during the presentation really stuck with me. The presenter said, during this crisis, do we look to the athletes? No, they're sidelined. We look to the STEM heroes. And so how are we taking this moment to motivate and inspire the next generation of STEM heroes? So do just check that out and join us on June 11th. I think we are very fortunate in terms of the educational innovation that we've had here in the state already, and building on that foundation will be good for our return. Our success here in terms of Boeing in Arizona is really has a great partner in terms of our community colleges. I see Anna from Pima Community College on the line, Maricopa Community College District, and then Central Arizona as well. Looking at what we've done to be innovative in the community college space with the Arizona Tech Corridor Network, how those partnerships can look at the current moment and shift to online curriculum wherever possible. I've spoken with a number of community college systems and know that they are working on that as feverishly as possible. And I think, like Allison said, is being able to respond to the current moment to up certification in any way possible. And then also going forward, looking at the mix of online and classroom work and how we can be responsive to new concerns from a pandemic perspective. Our fabrication centers depend on innovative programs within those community colleges. Particularly, we point to the Mesa Community College having electrical fabrication training, and looking at how we can do those in modified or online ways. I know they've been very responsive. Arizona State University of Arizona, how that they've already been leaders in transitioning education to meet the 21st century demands. We have great partners here. I think to the degree that we all work together, we're going to be able to be stronger than we were before. lastly, I just say, for those that are facing challenges with employment, Allison and I both sit on Workforce Arizona Council, the state's workforce board, to implement the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Our teams are working around the clock to be able to respond to the current situation, but we already are talking and have an executive committee meeting this Thursday. Again, how are we going to not just meet the current moment, but proceed to support all of those going forward, what their new needs may be in terms of employment and searching for those opportunities.
Mark, I'm going to start with you first on this next question. Are there aspects of our state or our region that will benefit supply chain resiliency for manufacturers in the future?
Yeah, so I would point to three things in that regard. I'd say Arizona can really benefit from looking at, again, like we talked about with the legislative session, our business environment, building upon that as we go forward, making sure to maintain the strength of our tax and the regulatory environment. Two, like we just talked about in terms of our workforce. So that resiliency is really built upon the strength of our potential employees and making sure that they have options in terms of telework and other items, but also the access to educational opportunities that they may need to meet the current moment. The last thing I note here, though, in terms of our potential for resiliency, where Arizona in particular can shine, is just the stable risk environment. So you see, obviously, a lot of attention goes to data centers in terms of why they would be located here. Less known, and what Boeing has chosen for Arizona is global security operations centers. Those centers that are doing risk assessment and also looking at monitoring protection assets for our employees around the globe. A lot of companies are deciding to put those here in Arizona. And so why is that? Because we don't have earthquakes, we don't have hurricanes, we don't have other natural disasters, tornadoes. So to the degree that we look at how can Arizona respond to being a stable risk environment from a pandemic perspective, so what does that mean in terms of looking at the space utilization that we have, looking at partnerships with the healthcare community, both at the state and local levels, and then understanding how we utilize our space and also our assets in terms of educational institutions, supply chain, curriculum at Arizona State is outstanding, and how that they are assessing the current moment to generate a workforce that is able to really help companies navigate new global supply chain challenges around the globe.
Allison, anything to add to this resiliency question?
No, I think, Mark, you covered it pretty well. I would just say that from a logistics perspective, just our position, in relation to Mexico, California, I think that is a real asset for us. And I think that we should, as a whole, as a state, and region, I think we should really ramp up the marketing efforts now, sooner rather than later, because I think that, as soon as we start to emerge from this, the economy will start to bounce back and projects will start to flow again. And that's when we're really going to start to see the recovery. And that's why the team at ACA and GPAC and other places will be so important, at working with the site selectors and all those that help companies expand and relocate into other markets.
I had a call today, by the way, with Sandra Watson, and she told me that one, none of the projects that they had underway here have stalled, things like Lucid and Nikola, and that while there's been some pause from some projects, about 70% of their projects are continuing to move forward. So that's a very good sign that Arizona continues to be attractive even in this environment. One of the things that COVID-19 has exposed is some significant deficiencies in supply chains. And, we saw that in PPE, but it's in many other areas as well. How can we bring some of that manufacturing back home to North America, at least, and perhaps to Arizona as well? What things can we be doing to position the state to help address those supply chain issues going forward? Allison, you want to start?
I will. I think you're exactly right. Getting product in and out of Asia has been, top concern for a lot of our companies. There's been severe shortages. Like I said earlier, I don't know that there was even enough PPE in the world to cover us. I've heard that. So there just simply wasn't enough product available. But yes, transporting it has been a real issue. I do think that we could do a little bit better job. As we come out of this, we're going to have the collective we, we'll have to have a debrief, a looking back on how could we have improved, what can we do better, and how can we better prepare for the future. And I do think that keeping, more supplies on hand is something that manufacturers will be taking a hard look at. And there's other types of ways too that I think we could look at our existing assets and leverage them for the future. We've been hearing from a lot of our companies that, for example, there's some raw materials that we have here that we have to ship overseas to Europe to be produced into other materials and then shipped back. It would be nice to sort of identify some key sectors or some key assets that, maybe we as leaders in the community, government officials, economic development people, maybe we can help bring some of that production at least to North America. And that's where our relationship with Mexican officials will be so critical. Governor Ducey, again, with his relationship with Sonora and other leaders in Mexico, I think that's really going to give us a leg up.
Mark?
Yeah, I just, building upon that, I say, thank goodness for USMCA passage and, the fact that, like you mentioned with Lucid and the opportunity there, and obviously their look at this region was very much around that partnership with us in Mexico. I think, obviously all companies now and as we come out of the current crisis are going to look at every single supply chain decision. And there's just going to be assessments that's done. And sometimes it'll make sense to continue with those current relationships. And then others will be driven by a different calculus from this current situation. So I think as Arizona continues to build upon the manufacturing environment we have here, I know Commerce Authority, GPEC, and others have done a great job of just highlighting how this region can support businesses as they make those assessments.
So there's an opportunity. Oh, go ahead. Oh, that was someone else. There's an opportunity for state leaders, associations like AMC and the Tech Council and manufacturers to come together post-COVID to really create a repository of Arizona existing supply chain assets. Allison, could you share how this proposed repository could be utilized for economic development and the private sector to build on Arizona's existing supply base and industrial base?
Sure, and I apologize. I think I may have jumped a bit ahead on my previous answer, but this has been an ongoing effort that we have been working on with the ACA. I know the Policy Academy has been working on this effort for some time, even pre-COVID, is identifying what are our plant assets, what are we making, and what are our raw inventory. And it's a big job. There isn't one central place where you can get sort of the answers and a list easily. And I think it's going to take some digging. I know, Dave Garofano and I have had many conversations offline about this, but it is going to take a coming together of Steve, your organization, the AMC, and many other groups. I think it's going to take, the Trucking Association and everybody else maybe surveying their members and coming together and, collecting responses and reviewing with each other, what are the key assets? where are they? How much of it do we have? What do we need? And what is the plan going forward? How can we have a good strategic plan to attract new companies and new investment? And even increase and maybe fund at higher levels and programs at the ACA and other places.
So I'm going to ask you both to answer this question. If you could look into your crystal ball and tell us what the manufacturing environment is going to look like here in Arizona 6 months from now, a year from now, a couple of years from now, in the post-COVID-19 era. What's going to happen in manufacturing in Arizona?
Mark, you want to start? Or?
Sure. I think you obviously will pay close attention to what the public health orders are, but I think you'll see companies make their own decisions to provide even just more flexibility for our workforce in any way possible. Like we talked about before, we've all responded to this current environment in much quicker fashion than I think any of us would have anticipated. And understanding that there are options for us to think about how we use our sites differently, how we distribute our supply chains differently. So 6 month time frame, I say, first off, we've got to understand what's happening with the virus, what's happening with testing. Those are all inputs that are feeding into leadership decisions across manufacturers as to how do we keep our employees safe, and how can we enable physical distancing in our facilities, set up remote work where possible. Going forward, then I think, some of what wouldn't have be considered prior will now be just the new normal in terms of differences of understanding how different shifts might work, rotating our employees in and out at different times, and then making, potentially different investment decisions in terms of locations across states, and then also looking at, educationally, what are we expecting of our workforce and education partners to be able to enable our next generation of workforce or retraining current workforce to meet those challenges. So I like the thought of the 6 month block because, early on it's been a week to week analysis, and then a month by month analysis. I think you'll see us all as manufacturers be very methodical, and again, keeping that open dialogue with our public health leaders, but also amongst each other. So forums such as with the Tech Council, Manufacturers Council, to share those best practices, understanding what's working, how are we able to think differently about utilization of our facilities, so we can achieve the top priority of keeping our employees safe, and then being able to also respond to continuing production and keep employment at levels and growing those going forward.
Yeah.
Allison, anything to add to that?
I think no doubt the industry has seen a sharp decline. I mean, the numbers are what they are. The NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, came out with a survey not too long ago of all of their 14,000 members that said 80% of their manufacturing members had their revenue streams had been negatively impacted by COVID. So, it's going to take a long time to dig out of this hole. Hopefully we're starting to see some positive news in 6 months. I think that's probably safe to say. But I think a full recovery, even a partial recovery is going to take, it is going to take longer, and it's going to take more support from the federal government and state government and agencies to really dig out.
So that special session is going to be important to that future. So we're starting to get some questions now from the audience. So the first one is, do we know if any group or company is setting up best practices for tracing or dealing with an outbreak within the manufacturing company when it's found? Either of you know of any best practices that are being used?
I would say that our companies are likely developing these best practices in-house. Certainly the companies that are producing the PPE and the other special equipment have their own best practices already. So I'm not aware of anything that's being shared outside per se, but I think that that's something that we could come together on and maybe focus on after this crisis is over to develop. And I think that's a really good point.
Anything, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's a great role that the Tech Council and Manufacturing Council can play. I've been impressed with our teams, our environmental health and safety teams in partnership with security. And then, we have a health department within Boeing on how they've responded. And really the best practices are coming from the public health departments, both state, local, and from the CDC and OSHA. And it's just, we're fortunate to have a lot of those experts on staff, but to the degree we've got smaller companies that are looking for further guidance, I think that is a great role that the various councils and chambers can play.
So the Tech Council launched a podcast with Radio X. It's called TechCast. And on the last episode, which was last week or the week before, we interviewed the CEO of Universal Avionics down in Tucson. And he did a really nice job of describing what happened. They had an employee that had COVID-19. And he did a really nice job talking about how they dealt with it, the things that they put in place subsequently, and how there hasn't been any spread in his company as a consequence of that. And, they're a manufacturer too, so they've continued to work. So for anybody who's listening, you should be able to find TechCast on our website and listen to that interview, at least for one best practice on how Universal Avionics dealt with it. Okay, I've got another question here from the audience. Would any manufacturers be willing to go to a 4-day on, 10-day off schedule here in Arizona to help prevent the spread?
So I'll jump in there. We've already done that with some of our teams in the past here in Arizona. Just prior to this, just being able to provide employees flexibility in terms of timing and schedules and be able to balance with family. So I am sure that manufacturers would be certainly open to that and open to even more innovative ways than they would have. Particularly we're talking again about how can we think about our shifts differently? How can we think about the work that has to be done in a production environment and how many people have to be in a particular space at a current time, and looking at, again, what really has to be done in person versus in a virtual, such as we see now. So I think given the resources that we have with the internet and computers and whatnot, we've already been moving in that regard. And I think, learning a lot from other industries in terms of what they're seeing in terms of employee engagement from different options available to them, and that this will probably just increase the speed with which we embrace those.
Any other examples, Allison, from AMC members that have gone to this kind of a work schedule?
I can't say I've heard particular examples, but I will say that all of our manufacturers have been willing to adapt and willing to let those workers that can work from home. So I certainly would not be surprised if there were other manufacturers in the AMC and across the state that are doing the same schedule.
So a comment from audience member, there is a comprehensive guide from Lear that they have made openly available. It's at www.lear.com/safe work playbook files. So if anyone's interested in that. So if anyone has any other questions, please put them in chat. Otherwise, I'm going to turn to ask Mark and Allison to provide any comments, things you wanted to say that I didn't ask, things that this audience might like to hear about what's going on in manufacturing. Allison, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I'm going to address, I see a question comment here. What would happen and how can we do things differently if this were to come up again in the fall, if we were to have a second wave in the fall? And I think that's an important point, really, because if this happens again in the fall, if it comes roaring back, which, hopefully it will not, but we are going to be better prepared. We're going to have so much more testing done. There's been lots of progress made on, potential vaccines and treatments. The University of Arizona is a great example. They are providing 250,000 tests. So, and of course, we've seen the testing blitz that are happening on Saturdays. So I think we're going to be able to identify the cases, have some treatment, options available. And then also we're already going to be in a good spot with our social distancing. And the companies, that are going to, sorry, my dog is back there. Companies are already going to know what to do. And I think they're going to be able to implement changes faster. And that's really going to be important in preventing a future spread this fall. So,
Mark?
Yeah, I think I would just say that we've had an interesting test case already, for those companies that were deemed essential businesses here in Arizona, taking the opportunities to learn from those companies on, what went right, what went wrong. And obviously, a lot of that's going to be driven by understanding from the public health departments. But then, talking about like the repository idea that we had previously, looking at how we can use that or just partnerships of the various councils and chambers to be able to share what essential businesses have learned, so that we'll be employing those and looking at new ideas should there be a second wave, and also just being able to communicate that to other companies that didn't go through that experience. I think in national security planning we talk about just the challenge of dealing with the fog of war. And I think, to this point of a repository idea and this sharing, again, the huge value of the Tech Council, the Manufacturers Council, is just that ability to share with other companies and understand what assets are out there, what individuals are seeing. With the Manufacturers Council board meetings, we go around just like the National Association of Manufacturers does at the start of every meeting and just chime in as to what's going on with our companies. And that sharing creates responses and solutions that wouldn't exist otherwise. Commend the various local chambers that have really embraced Arizona with a team of teams approach. Mesa Industry and Defense Council, the West Valley Defense Alliance have done more than I think you would have ever assumed possible just by this collaborative, very horizontally partnered organizations. So I know that I'm grateful from a Boeing perspective of the work that both of you have done, and it's in that collaboration and sharing in sessions like this that I think we'll all be able to be better with the current crisis continuing.
By the way, Lee Goldstein has placed the link for the TechCast episode that I mentioned in the chat area. So I want to thank you both for the time you spent with us today, providing your insights and information on what's going on in manufacturing. It was very helpful and useful to me. I'm sure it was to the rest of the audience as well. Appreciate everything both of you are doing to support the manufacturing sector here in Arizona. The governor, before COVID-19, was very proud to say that our economy has been significantly diversified since, say, the last situation we had in the Great Recession, in that there are now more manufacturing jobs in Arizona than construction jobs. And I think we're all really proud of that. You both have mentioned Dave Garifano. Dave is a good partner of the Tech Council as well. For those of you that don't know, he runs the Manufacturing Extension Partnership under the Arizona Commerce Authority. They have lots of resources and assistance for manufacturers. So reach out to Dave or Allison or the Tech Council, and we're there to serve. So again, thank you both for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you so much, Steve.
So I have a few comments to make. I just want to remind everyone that there are sponsorships available for these events. Again, contact aztechcouncil.org or events@aztechcouncil.org. And we have a huge lineup of virtual events coming up over the next month. Take a look at our schedule, and we'll see you all at the next one. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.